From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. France could be on the brink of a revolution.
Mes chers compatriotes, la démocratie a parlé et les Français ont placé le Rassemblement national et ses alliés en tête et ont pratiquement effacé le bloc macroniste.
The victory for Marine Le Pen's party, the hard-right National Rally, triggered protests in Paris. All eyes are on the next round of voting this weekend. By Monday morning, Le Pen's party could be forming a new government, much to the alarm of many in France and across Europe, not least the French Prime Minister.
Mais ce soir n'est pas un soir comme les autres.
Tonight is not just another night. You know me, I'm not going to beat about the bush. Tonight's lesson is that the far right is on the doorstep of power. Never in our democracy has the National Assembly risked being dominated by the far right as it was tonight.
The story today: are the far right about to take power in France?
My name is Peter Conradi. I'm based in Paris as the Europe editor at the Sunday Times.
Peter, we're talking on Monday morning after quite the weekend. Talk us through Sunday.
Yes, quite the weekend indeed. What we've just had is the first round of the snap parliamentary election that was called by Emmanuel Macron 3 weeks ago, after his party suffered a pretty humiliating defeat in the European elections. And the result, in one sense, is very much as predicted. By far the largest number of votes was won by the National Rally Party of Marine Le Pen, which sits very firmly on the right of French politics. They've won, together with their allies, something like 33% of the vote. Few points behind them is the so-called New Popular Front, which is a temporary alliance of moderate socialists and far left socialists who were on 28% or so. And Macron's own party trails pretty badly with just over 20%.
Not a great result for him. But at the same time, one of the reasons he called this election was because the right was so wildly successful in the European elections. People did think it might be over after one round. It clearly isn't. What happens now?
What happens now is that under the French electoral system, we have a second round runoff next Sunday, which will decide the allocation of seats in the Assemblée nationale, the lower house of the French parliament. I mean, the French political system is a curious one, to put it mildly. The country is divided up into constituencies. There are 577 of them. And in each of those constituencies, there is a first-past-the-post contest, much as there is in Britain. But there is a difference, which is that, normally speaking, the two candidates that have won the most votes then go forward to a straightforward runoff in the second round. Sometimes, however, you can have a situation where you have a so-called triangular contest in the third round, which is when a third candidate also qualifies because he or she has received a substantial share of the vote. And then things get very, very complicated indeed.
And Peter, we know after the first round, we know there are about 300 out of 500 and something seats where there is a third candidate who qualifies, who received enough votes in the first round to go through to the next. Will all of them stand next weekend?
Well, no. I mean, that's the very interesting thing about French politics, and that's what makes the second round result, i.e. the ultimate result, very difficult to predict. Because what we've got is basically three political blocks here that are fighting against each other. They all hate each other, but they sort of hate each other with a varying degree of intensity. So basically, the other two hate Marine Le Pen's party, and so they are really determined to do everything to prevent the National Rally from winning the second round. So that means that those on the far left, or left to far left, I suppose we should call them, of the so-called New Popular Front, they have said very clearly that if one of their candidates is in one of these so-called triangular races in the second round, they will withdraw and they will urge their supporters instead to transfer their vote to Macron's bloc, because they are determined to do everything to keep out the National Rally. So that's kind of straightforward.
So this is quite organised tactical voting.
It is. It's a very organised tactical voting. And, you know, there is a logic to it, because if you were to add together in most constituencies the share of the vote that was won by Macron centrists and by the left, it would be substantially greater than the vote of the National Rally. So there is a clear logic to it. If you say, right, the one thing we have to do is keep out the far right, then that's the way to vote. So then you have the situation, what does Macron's bloc say? Now, Macron's bloc is saying slightly different things depending on whom you listen to. So there are some within the bloc who have said, we should do exactly the same thing. Whenever there's one of these triangular contests, we're in third place, which, given Macron's bloc performance, is likely to be the majority of them. In those circumstances, we should step back and we should let the left take on the far right, and we should urge our supporters to back the left. The problem, though, is a gentleman called Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is the leader of one of the elements, the most far left element in this left-wing bloc, called France Unbowed.
Nulle part, nous ne permettrons au RN de l'emporter, et c'est pourquoi, dans l'hypothèse où il serait arrivé en tête, tandis que nous ne serions qu'en troisième position, nous retirerons notre candidature.
And there is genuine alarm among the centrists about him, about his party's policies. And so there are some within the Macron camp who've said, basically, yes, we should withdraw in favour of the left, but only if it's the moderate candidates for the left. If, however, there is a candidate standing in one of the constituencies who represents Mélenchon's party, then we shouldn't stand down. And the logical result, probably in a lot of those places, would then be that the far right would win.
So this does get quite complicated, and all of that horse trading will be taking place over the next 36 hours. By 6 p.m. on Tuesday, we'll know where there will be a third candidate standing. Just to get to a bit of clarity on that very complicated 3D chess, talk us through it, because everything in France seems to come in three stripes. There are three big characters who will determine the future here. Let's start with the centrists and Macron, the face of the centre. Why did he call this election? Why has he taken this mad gamble now?
I think Macron realised that he was basically running out of steam domestically. I mean, his problems go back to 2022, when he was re-elected for a second term. Now, the first time he won in 5 years earlier, there was a huge degree of enthusiasm for him. By 2022, a lot of that enthusiasm had gone, but ultimately, when voters were faced with a straight choice between him and Marine Le Pen in the presidential contest, the second round of the presidential contest, large numbers of them voted for him, Macron. What went wrong, though, was the parliamentary elections a couple of months later, when his party lost the absolute majority which it had in Parliament, which has meant that since then, he has been governing with essentially a minority government. Now, for a lot of things in French politics, you can get away with that. It's not like Britain, it's not like Germany. France is not a parliamentary democracy. It's a kind of hybrid. It's partly presidential, it's partly parliamentary. But it was becoming more and more difficult for Macron to get his legislation through Parliament without resorting to presidential decrees. When he did that last year, it triggered mass protests in the country, which is when he pushed through a pension reform which raised the retirement age in France. And he was looking forward to this autumn when there were a number of key votes coming up, particularly on the budget. And he realized that he just couldn't continue like this. He took the European Parliament elections as a kind of a pretext for saying, we can't go on like this. We have to decide who runs the country, who you want to run the country, and tried to cast this essentially as a battle between the centre, his forces, and the far right of Marine Le Pen.
Comme président de la République, le jour d'après ces élections législatives, j'aurai, comme le veut la Constitution, à tirer les conséquences et à choisir un Premier ministre. Mais ce n'est pas donner les clés du pouvoir, c'est permettre de gouverner à des forces politiques qui auront été choisies par les Françaises et les Français.
But this might all backfire.
Well, it backfired in large part because he underestimated the third element in this triangle, which is the left. He assumed that the various parties on the left who had all fought the European Parliament elections on their own, he thought that they would remain divided. And if you are divided in the French system, you never make it through to the second round. He was completely wrong-footed because these various parties on the left, although they are very, very far apart from each other on a number of issues, be it the economy, be it support for Palestine, all these kind of touchstone issues that one sees, across Europe. Within just 4 days, they had got together and they had agreed to, essentially divvy up the 577 constituencies in the country between them, not to stand against each other. So that turned what Macron hoped was going to be a straight fight between his forces and the far right into this much more complicated triangular fight.
And we're sort of seeing the centre being squeezed. It seems to be disappearing very quickly. For people outside of France, just try and give us a sense of why Macron is so unpopular, why the centre seems to be collapsing.
This really is the paradox of French politics and of Emmanuel Macron. By any measure, Macron has not actually done a bad job of governing France, particularly if you look at the economy. He's turned France into a much more competitive country internationally. There's been a big surge in inward investment. A lot of businesses from the City of London, banks, others have moved to France. Unemployment has come down quite considerably. He got France through COVID quite effectively. So he's got all these things that should be on his side, that should be helping him. But he is almost universally derided, hated even, by large majority of the French people. I mean, in the run-up to the election, I traveled quite widely around France to very different places, to the former industrial north, which has maybe a lot in common with Britain's Red Wall. There, the people seem to hate Macron. I traveled to rural France in the south. There, they seem to hate him as well.
What do they say about him?
The basic complaint, I think, is that he is the president of the rich. That is a phrase that everyone, unprompted, comes up with, le président des riches. It's partly his background as a former investment banker, partly also, I think, that one of his first actions on coming to power in 2017 was to get rid of the wealth tax, which had been in place in France for a number of years, which was immediately seized on by his opponents. And he's just found that tag very, very difficult to shake off.
So Macron explains why the centre has been losing ground. It does seem, as you've explained, that so much of this election now is about the centre and the left trying to keep the right out of power. So tell us about them. Tell us about Le Pen's party. What do they actually believe in? What are their policies? How far to the right are they? And why are they doing so well in modern France?
Well, this is the other important element, I think. One is the deep unpopularity of Emmanuel Macron. The second real takeaway from this election is the extent to which the National Rally Party of Marine Le Pen has been the beneficiary of this discontent. And I mean, and this is not something that has suddenly come out of the blue, that is just happening now. If you step back a bit, you look at this party, which was founded by her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, back in 1972. He was a very, very controversial figure. Some of his mates were in the Nazi SS during the Second World War. He was very firmly on the far right French politics. This was essentially a fringe party which appealed to a minority of disgruntled people very firmly on the right. But the National Rally, as it's now known, rather than the National Front, is a very, very different party, because what has happened is that Marine Le Pen, his daughter, took over in 2011 from him, gradually marginalized her father, and even essentially ejected him from the party a few years later. She had realized that there was no way the party was ever going to be a successful mainstream political force if it was so extreme. So she has basically pulled the party towards the center. She's made it much more electable, much more normal. Jordan Bardella, her protege, still only 28. He's been the president of the party for a few years. He was leading the campaign for this election, as he did the campaign for the European Parliament election a few weeks back. And they fought a very sophisticated, very disciplined campaign, which is based essentially on 3 planks, which they have been repeating at every stage.
La relance du pouvoir d'achat, le rétablissement de la sécurité sur tout le territoire, la reprise en main de notre politique d'immigration seront les priorités de notre action. Nous entendons ramener le pays à la raison budgétaire en réalisant les économies qui permettront de financer l'intégralité des mesures de pouvoir d'achat et les ajustements que nous apporterons, par exemple, au système de retraite.
They are essentially doing something about declining living standards. The French have been hit, as people in Britain, as people everywhere have been hit by rising energy prices, by inflation in the aftermath of the war in Ukraine. Element number 1 is vote for us and we will improve your purchasing power, as the French would classify it. Secondly, has been a tough line on law and order. The message basically to voters is the country is falling apart, criminals are getting away with murder, not enough is being done to make the streets safe. We've got to be tougher. Linked with that is number 3, which has always been the central policy of the party, whatever its guise, both under Marine and under her father, which is being very, very tough on immigration, being hostile also to some extent to people of immigrant origin who are based in France, linking it also with the law and order issue, implicit in a lot of what the party says, even if they don't say it directly, is these people of non-French origin are largely responsible for the breakdown of law and order.
Wow.
You put all those together, you keep repeating them, and it's a message that goes down very well in large swathes of the country.
And Peter, as you say, Le Pen's father was far further to the right, and there is still, a lasting... France has the history of the Vichy period. There is still sort of a lasting fear for much of the country of letting the country go further, swing to the right in the way that it would have under Marine Le Pen's father. But how far right would you say it is now, compared to the rest of Europe, in its anti-immigrant rhetoric, in its nationalism?
I would think that if you, say, compare it with Italy, Giorgia Meloni, who has been in power for the past couple of years, we're in a very similar situation, I think. There again, we have a party which has got quite dubious historical roots. In the case of Meloni, it's the links with Mussolini, with the neo-fascists, because her party is, in a sense, their heir. I mean, in power in Italy, Meloni's party has actually not proven that far right. And when they're confronted with immigration, which was, again, a big issue for them, they haven't actually been especially radical when dealing with it. So, the same may be true of Marine Le Pen's party, because If they do come to power after the second round on Sunday, and if Jordan Bardella were to become prime minister, yes, they've got their program, but they are also constrained. They'll be constrained by the fact that Emmanuel Macron is the president, and under the French constitution, the president retains an enormous amount of powers. There is also a constitutional council, which will scrutinize very carefully any legislation that they bring in. We'll look at it to see if it is in accordance with the French constitution itself, which could mean that they would strike down anything that might be perceived to discriminate against people of foreign origin. And thirdly, there is the European Union, of which France is a part. The National Rally has watered down previous threats, promises, whatever you want to call them, to have a Frexit, to leave the euro. They want to stay in the EU, and so there are also a number of EU rules that they will come up against. So in power, it would be perhaps not as dramatic as a lot of its critics fear.
Peter, as you were explaining, the really unexpected element in this election has turned out to be the coalition on the left. Tell us a bit about them, and tell us about, in particular, Mélenchon, and why he's such a fear for the centre.
Jean-Luc Mélenchon has been a feature of the French political scene for some time now. He is the founder of a party called France Unbowed, which is basically on the far left of the political spectrum. He sort of sprung to prominence in 2017 when the presidential election, which was won by Macron, when he came out of nowhere to get almost 20% of the vote in the first round, which was pretty impressive. And, essentially what happened in the intervening period is that if you look at the left, which is quite divided in France, he has basically come to dominate it, which is, in a sense, flipping everything round, because previously it was you look back in recent French political history, it was more the mainstream left that was dominant. People like François Mitterrand, who was president for 14 years, and then after that, François Hollande. Mélenchon somehow, from the far left, managed to become the dominant figure, while the mainstream left kind of crumbled. And that is sort of partly, I think, also is the fault of Macron, because a number of people who were on the more moderate, sort of centre-left, I suppose, have moved over to the Macron camp. We shouldn't forget that Macron himself was actually a minister in the previous socialist government of François Hollande. So left voters have been increasingly attracted to Mélenchon. The comparison is maybe a little bit cliched, but, he has a lot in common in terms of his views with Jeremy Corbyn. He appeals to the same kind of people. Despite being age 72, he goes down very well with young people on the left, sort of committed activists. He's very big on Palestine, the rights of the Palestinians. There is also, perhaps not surprisingly given that, a whiff of anti-Semitism around some of the candidates in his party, which makes him and the party toxic as far as a number of mainstream voters are concerned.
And that leaves this whole negotiation in a bit of a mess. What are the potential scenarios that happen now come the weekend and round two?
The whole situation, as we're speaking now, is very, very uncertain indeed, because you look at it and you think the National Rally is won, they're going to form the next government. Well, not necessarily.
So that would be an outright win for the right.
There is a scenario under which the National Rally and some of its allies on the right of the Republican Party, which is we haven't spoken about so far, but which is the sort of the mainstream right-wing party, which has largely crumbled, together they could get the 289 seats that they need to give them a majority in Parliament, which would leave Macron with little alternative but to summon Jordan Bardella to become the next prime minister. That would be, in a sense, the most straightforward scenario, in the sense that we would have a situation where there would be a party which had a clear majority in parliament, albeit in opposition to the president. So that would give us a period of so-called cohabitation, which would be complicated, but at least people would know where they stood, although there would be huge opposition clearly in the country to the fact that the far right were in power. So that's scenario number one.
And in that straightforward scenario, does Macron carry on? Would he resign in despair?
Well, Macron has said that he would carry on. There's no reason to think that he wouldn't. I mean, his term as president runs for another 3 years. He would continue to wield considerable power over foreign policy, over defense policy, over a number of other areas. And he would also have the ability, I think, to complicate life enormously for this new government, which stands for everything, that he's opposed to. So yes, he could well stand on, but it would be a very turbulent 3 years. There is the possibility that he would hope that this new government would do badly, that it would trip up. And under the constitution, he would then have the right to dissolve parliament again and have yet another parliamentary election. So this could be his master plan. Let the far right win, but then let them show that they're so hopeless at governing that the voters will reject them a year from now and set everything up for his successor, because he can't stand again, to beat the far right in the presidential election in 2027. That is one hypothesis. That is one scenario that we could see. So then we get into even more complicated territory, which is that no one has a majority in the parliament. And, what happens then?
What if we end up with the right winning the most votes, but not enough to have an outright majority? Will there be any movement from the centre or from the left to help them form a government?
So that's where things get complicated. The only people who would team up with the National Rally would be the Republicans, the centre-right party. Now, the Republicans themselves are divided. A few of them, including their leader, Eric Ciotti, have already formally backed the National Rally. So they're already in. The big uncertainty is what the remaining Republicans would do. It could be that if the National Rally is quite close to getting the magic 289 seats it needs, those other Republicans would come over and in return, perhaps for posts in the government, would back the National Rally, which would mean we would still have Jordan Bardella as Prime Minister. Alternatively, we could be in a situation where the National Rally falls quite a long way short of this 289. There aren't enough Republicans who are prepared to team up with them. And we would then be in a situation where probably no one would have an absolute majority, which would then, I suppose, lead to Macron trying to put together a coalition of his own party and moderate members of the left, perhaps excluding Mélenchon's party. A third possibility, if that fails then, would be perhaps a technocratic government with sort of non-political figures. Now, that for France would be a novelty, but we've seen that in the past in Italy. That could well happen.
And Peter, if you were a betting man, which of those scenarios do you think is the most likely to win?
It is just so finely balanced.
Where's your money?
I'm a little reluctant to put my money anywhere. It all depends on what happens in the next few days. It all depends on how many candidates withdraw in these so-called triangular seats. And it also depends, crucially, on the extent to which voters are prepared to follow the advice which is given to them by the party that they voted for in the first round. And the signs are that voters these days aren't prepared to listen. The idea that people will do what their political masters tell them is no longer the case, particularly in France. that in a sense explains why they voted so convincingly against Macron.
And Peter, you've lived in France for a few years now. Have you sensed the country changing? Have you sensed this sort of underlying change? It feels like yesterday when you had this sudden rush, this great excitement for this new centrist party coming along. What's changed in France?
I think what is striking is the degree of dissatisfaction that there is in France. I live in Paris, not in the most affluent part, in a sort of a fairly edgy part in the 11th arrondissement, near Bastille, kind of a traditionally working class area, which is now fairly middle class. People are fairly well off. People appear to be having a fairly pleasant life. But you just need to go outside Paris and talk to people anywhere else almost. And there is such a degree of dissatisfaction. It's difficult to pin down why, but there's this feeling, I think, of being left behind, being ignored, being treated as second-class citizens by these elites in Paris. And there's a sense in which France is divided into three blocks, I suppose, not just politically, but sociologically. You have the relatively affluent city dwellers in the big cities, in Paris, in Lyon, also in Marseille, who are fairly centrist, fairly liberal in their political views. You have the working classes in the fairly rough suburbs around Paris, but also around the other big cities, who are fairly left-leaning. A number of them are probably of immigrant origin. They're also fairly dissatisfied, I think, with a lot, often for good reason. And then you have the third element, the kind of what is called la France périphérique, who are the sort of peripheral France, the people who live in small towns, who live in the countryside, the citizens of somewhere. And they feel left behind. And we saw a sign of their discontent a few years back in 2018, 2019, with the so-called Yellow Vest protests, which started off as a protest against a rise in the fuel prices, or the tax on diesel in particular, an environmental measure which was seen as being imposed by the elites in Paris who don't drive anywhere and just take the metro. And this turned into a full-blooded kind of rural come small town revolt against the centre. It went for a few years, it petered out, but the same kind of people who I used to see in those days standing on roundabouts with placards protesting against the government, a lot of them have gone on to vote for the National Rally. And, these are the kind of people that are the core support for Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella.
That was Peter Conradi, Europe editor for the Sunday Times. And do listen back to a recent episode we did with Peter about Jordan Bardella, the 28-year-old leader of the National Rally, who could be the next Prime Minister. We've put a link in the description notes to this episode. You can find all the latest on the French elections, including all the horse trading in the run-up to the weekend, online at thetimes.com. And it's a big week for election coverage across the Times and on The Story. Tomorrow, we'll be bringing you an episode about the future of the Democrats and their bid for the White House. And then on Friday, we'll bring you a special podcast on the UK election results. I'll be staying up so you don't have to. Don't miss it. The producer today was Edward Drummond, the executive producer was Fiona Leach, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. If you can, please do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.